Everyone assumed Hannah Whitaker had finally lost her mind. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, she drove across eastern Montana, stopping at abandoned ranches, roadside repair piles, and weather-beaten fence lines, asking owners for only one thing they couldn't wait to throw away: broken cedar fence posts. Not the straight ones, not the new ones, only the cracked, twisted, half-rotted pieces that looked completely useless. She loaded them carefully into the back of her pickup, drove home without explaining herself, and stacked every post inside an old machine shed on her family's ranch. For nearly a year, nobody understood why. By the following autumn, agricultural researchers would stand on that same ranch in stunned silence, trying to explain how those discarded fence posts had quietly transformed an entire hillside. The people who laughed the loudest would become the first to ask Hannah how she'd done it. If you've ever wondered whether the things most people dismiss might be hiding their greatest value, you're in the right place. Stay with this story, because before it ends, you'll discover that the real secret was never inside the wood itself. It was something almost an entire community had forgotten. The Whitaker Ranch stretched across nearly 60 acres on the rolling plains of eastern Montana. For 3 generations, cattle had grazed those hills, but the land wasn't as forgiving as it once had been. Winters ended earlier, sudden storms carved deep channels through the pastures, and every heavy rain carried away another layer of precious topsoil. Hannah's father, Daniel Whitaker, spent more time repairing erosion damage than improving the ranch. Feed prices kept rising, equipment repairs never seemed to end, and each season felt more uncertain than the last. Selling a portion of the property had quietly become a conversation no one wanted to have out loud. Hannah had returned home after studying rangeland ecology, not because she believed she had all the answers, but because she couldn't shake one lesson she'd learned. The land often remembers what people forget. Old trails, forgotten tree lines, and abandoned fence rows weren't random leftovers. Sometimes they revealed how the landscape naturally worked, if someone took the time to pay attention. One afternoon, while repairing storm damage, she noticed something that refused to leave her mind. Across a badly eroded hillside, newer fence sections had collapsed or washed away years ago. Yet several broken cedar posts from an older fence still rested almost exactly where they'd fallen decades earlier. Stranger still, the soil surrounding those weathered posts remained firm, while the open ground nearby had been carved into shallow gullies. Most people would have stepped over them without another thought. Hannah went home, grabbed a notebook, and returned before sunrise the next morning. Within weeks, she was driving across the county collecting broken cedar posts from anyone willing to give them away. That's when the jokes began. Neighbors slowed their trucks just to watch her unload another pile of rotten wood. Some called it the strangest hobby they'd ever seen. Others said college had filled her head with ideas that didn't belong on a working ranch. But one neighbor, Carl Benson, wasn't laughing anymore. He pulled into the Whitakers' driveway one evening, looked at the growing stack of posts, and shook his head. "You know what your problem is?" he said to Daniel. "Your daughter is chasing experiments while this ranch needs fixing. Broken fence posts don't pay the feed bill." The words lingered long after Carl drove away. Daniel never repeated them, but Hannah could see the doubt growing in his silence. Every Saturday she spent searching for old cedar was a Saturday she wasn't repairing fences, patching water lines, or helping prepare for winter. Money was getting tighter. Time was running shorter. If she was wrong, she wouldn't just lose a year's worth of work. She might lose her father's trust and the last realistic chance to pull the ranch back from the edge. Still, every broken cedar post she picked up seemed to be pointing toward the same forgotten answer. She just hadn't figured out how to prove it. Yet, by the end of summer, the old machine shed could barely hold another fence post. Some were split clean down the middle. Others were blackened by decades of rain and snow. Every one of them looked like firewood, waiting for a match. To everyone else, the growing pile was proof that Hannah had wasted an entire season. To Hannah, it was evidence. Every post carried a small handwritten tag, a ranch name, the direction it had originally faced, the slope where it had been found, even the type of cedar. At night, after finishing chores, she spread county maps across the kitchen table and marked every location with colored pencils. Her father would sometimes walk past, glance at the maps, and quietly head to bed without saying a word. The silence hurt more than criticism ever could. One evening, Hannah finally noticed something impossible to ignore. Nearly every weathered cedar post she'd collected came from hillsides that had suffered surprisingly little erosion, even after years of neglect. Meanwhile, newer fences built in perfectly straight lines often sat beside deep washouts and bare patches of exhausted soil. It couldn't be coincidence. She drove back to several of those abandoned ranches, this time carrying an old survey compass instead of an empty trailer. Hours passed as she measured slopes, followed the contours of the land, and compared them with the faded notes in her notebook. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. The oldest fence builders hadn't always placed their fences where property lines looked neat. They'd often followed the natural shape of the hills instead. But why? The answer refused to come. When Hannah mentioned her observations during a monthly conservation meeting in town, the room fell quiet for only a moment before someone chuckled. Maybe folks built crooked fences because they didn't own a straight measuring tape. Laughter spread through the room. Another rancher leaned back in his chair. Or maybe they just didn't have college kids explaining history to them. Hannah smiled politely, gathered her notes, and walked out without arguing. Yet one person hadn't laughed. An elderly, retired range conservationist named Walter Briggs caught up with her in the parking lot. "I knew men who built some of those old fences," he said. "Trust me, they weren't careless." He paused, studying the notebook tucked beneath her arm. "If you're seeing a pattern, don't stop now." Then he added something that stayed with Hannah the entire drive home. They weren't building fences to control cattle. They were building them to control something else. Walter climbed into his pickup before Hannah could ask another question. She stood there frozen. For the first time in months, someone had confirmed she wasn't imagining things. But if those old fence lines had never been just fences, what had they really been built to control? Walter Briggs' words refused to leave Hannah's mind. They weren't building fences to control cattle. They were building them to control something else. The next morning, instead of collecting more fence posts, Hannah drove to the County Historical Archives, a small brick building tucked behind the courthouse. Dust covered the shelves, and most visitors came searching for family records, not forgotten ranch maps. An elderly archivist listened patiently as Hannah explained what she was looking for. "Old grazing maps?" the woman asked with a smile. "You might be surprised how much those old ranchers wrote down." An hour later, Hannah was carefully unfolding hand-drawn maps that hadn't been touched in decades. Something immediately caught her attention. The oldest fence lines weren't perfectly straight. They curved, sometimes gently, sometimes dramatically. At first they looked random. Then Hannah laid one transparent survey sheet over a modern topographic map. Her heart skipped. The fences weren't following property boundaries at all. They were following the shape of the land. Every curve matched a contour where rainwater naturally slowed before flowing downhill. She checked another map, then another. The same pattern appeared every time. Those old ranchers hadn't built crooked fences because they lacked better tools. They'd built them because they understood the hills. For the first time, Hannah believed she knew what the fence secret really was. She rushed home, spread her own maps across the workshop floor, and spent the next 3 days drawing careful contour lines across the Whitaker ranch. Every broken cedar post she'd collected suddenly had a possible place. But believing something and proving it were two very different things. Instead of rebuilding an entire fence, Hannah chose a small test section on the ranch's most damaged hillside. She drove each broken cedar post only halfway into the ground, following the natural contour instead of a straight line. The posts weren't meant to stop cattle. They were meant to interrupt the speed of rainwater. Between each section, she left narrow openings exactly where excess water could safely escape without cutting new channels through the soil. Her father watched from the pickup truck, but said very little. Finally, as the sun disappeared behind the ridge, he walked over and looked across the unfinished line. "You really think a pile of broken wood is going to stop a mountain of water?" he asked quietly. Hannah looked at the hillside. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think the people who built these fences 80 years ago already knew the answer." Daniel nodded once, though the worry never left his face. The weather forecast called for the biggest storm the valley had seen all summer. By the end of the week, Hannah would discover whether she'd uncovered a forgotten piece of ranching wisdom or spent an entire year chasing an illusion. The storm arrived just after midnight, not with thunder at first, with wind. A cold, steady wind that swept across the Montana Valley before the sky finally opened. Within minutes, rain hammered the ranch roof so hard, Hannah could barely hear the weather radio sitting on the kitchen counter. She didn't sleep. Every few hours, she stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, staring toward the dark hillside where her broken cedar posts disappeared into the rain. She wasn't worried about the wood. She was worried about being wrong. If the old ranchers had built those fences for another reason entirely, if she'd misunderstood the pattern, then months of work would wash downhill before sunrise. By dawn, nearly 3 inches of rain had fallen, the kind of storm that usually left fresh gullies across the Whitaker pasture. Hannah pulled on her boots before the rain had even stopped. Her father was already waiting beside the truck. Neither of them spoke during the drive. As they reached the hillside, Hannah's stomach tightened. several cedar posts had shifted. One section had completely collapsed where the soil beneath it had been softer than she'd expected. Water had carved around the weakened corner, leaving part of her experiment twisted and half buried in mud. For a long moment, she simply stared. Her father rested a hand on one of the broken posts. "I think we've seen enough," he said quietly. "We've got real fences that still need repairing." It wasn't anger, it was disappointment. And somehow, that hurt far more. Hannah knelt in the mud instead of answering. She watched tiny streams of rainwater continue moving downhill. Then something caught her eye. Even where the cedar posts had failed, the water wasn't behaving the way it normally did. Instead of racing straight down the slope, it slowed behind each remaining section, spreading gently across the grass before continuing downhill. The collapsed pieces hadn't stopped the water, but the section still standing had changed its speed. That wasn't failure, that was a clue. She pulled her soaked notebook from her jacket and began writing as rain dripped from its pages. The posts hadn't been strong enough. The placement had been right. The anchoring had been wrong. On the drive home, Hannah barely looked out the window. She filled page after page with sketches, arrows, and measurements, trying to understand what the storm had just taught her. Late that afternoon, she remembered something Walter Briggs had said almost in passing. The old-timers never relied on the posts alone. At the time, she'd been too focused to ask what he meant. Now, those words felt completely different. If the cedar posts had never been doing the job by themselves, then what invisible partner had been helping them hold an entire hillside together for generations? The following morning, Hannah drove straight to Walter Briggs' ranch. The old conservationist was already outside, repairing a cattle gate as if he'd been expecting her. "You were right," Hannah said before climbing out of the truck. "The posts weren't enough." Walter looked at her for a moment, then quietly set his tools aside. "I figured the rain would bring you here." Without another word, he led her across one of the oldest pastures on his property. They walked nearly half a mile before stopping beside a weathered cedar fence that had stood there for generations. At first glance, it looked no different from hundreds of forgotten fences scattered across Montana. Walter rested one hand on a cracked cedar post and stared across the hillside for several seconds, as though deciding whether Hannah was finally ready to see what had always been there. Then he slowly knelt. "Come here." Hannah crouched beside him. Walter brushed away the tall grass with the back of his hand. "Look closer." At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she pressed her fingers into the soil. Instead of crumbling beneath her hand like the dry ground on her own hillside, it felt cool, springy, and tightly woven together. Walter gently lifted a small clump of grass, exposing a dense network of fine roots stretching beneath the surface in every direction. The soil didn't fall apart. It stayed locked together. "Blue bunch wheatgrass," Walter said quietly. "Western fescue, too." He let the roots settle back into place. Hannah barely heard him. She was still staring at what lay beneath the grass. In that instant, the missing piece finally revealed itself. The cedar posts had never been holding the hillside together by themselves. The prairie had been doing most of the work all along. Walter finally broke the silence. "The old ranchers understood something we slowly forgot." He looked across the pasture. They protected the grass first. Nothing more needed to be said. Back at the Whitaker ranch, Hannah tore out half of her original design. Instead of rebuilding the damaged contour exactly as before, she widened it. Between every section of cedar, she carefully replanted native bunch grasses using seed gathered from healthy prairie nearby. Where runoff struck hardest, she covered the young seedlings with light straw, giving their roots time to establish before the next heavy rain. Her father watched from the porch. "You've started over," he said quietly. Hannah shook her head. "No! I finally understand what I was building." For the first time in months, Daniel didn't argue. He picked up a shovel, walked to the hillside, and drove it into the earth beside the next cedar post. He never said he believed her. He didn't have to. By early autumn, thin ribbons of green traced the contour lines across the pasture. Most neighbors never noticed them. Hannah noticed every inch, because she knew the real work wasn't happening above the ground anymore. It was happening where no one could see it. And within days, those unseen roots would face the biggest storm the valley had seen in years. The storm arrived almost 2 days earlier than anyone expected. Before sunrise, heavy clouds swallowed the Montana Valley, hiding the distant ridges one by one until the entire landscape seemed wrapped in gray. By mid-morning, rain was falling in relentless sheets, drumming against barn roofs and turning every pasture into a patchwork of shallow pools. Across the valley, ranchers rushed to prepare. Tractors were moved onto higher ground. Cattle were pushed away from creek beds. Local radio stations interrupted their regular programming with flood advisories that sounded painfully familiar to everyone who had lived through previous seasons. Hannah wasn't helping move equipment. She was standing halfway up the hillside, completely soaked. Her eyes never left the thin ribbons of native grass growing between the weathered cedar posts. She wasn't watching the storm, she was watching what the water decided to do. At first, nothing looked different. Rainwater rushed downhill exactly the way it always had. For one unsettling moment, Hannah wondered if she'd misunderstood everything. Had an entire year of work really come down to another failed experiment? Then, something changed. As the runoff reached the first contour line, it didn't slam through the hillside. It slowed. Only for a moment. But moments matter when water is moving downhill. Instead of carving straight through the pasture, the runoff spread gently sideways behind the cedar posts, soaking into the waiting grass before continuing forward. The second contour repeated the same pattern. Then the third. Then every contour above it. The hillside wasn't trying to stop the rain. It was teaching the water to slow down. Daniel stood beside his daughter without saying a word. Months earlier, he had watched piles of broken fence posts fill an old machine shed. Now he was watching those same discarded pieces quietly protect the land his family had struggled to save for years. Neither of them noticed Walter Briggs pulling his pickup onto the edge of the pasture. The old conservationist climbed the hill slowly, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. For several minutes he simply watched. Finally, he smiled. "You see it now?" Hannah nodded without taking her eyes off the hillside. "I thought the fence was stopping the water." Walter shook his head. "It never was." He pointed toward the green strip stretching between the cedar posts. "The fence only bought time." He tapped the wet ground with the toe of his boot. The roots did the rest. By late afternoon, nearly 4 inches of rain had fallen. On neighboring ranches, muddy runoff poured across county roads, carrying precious topsoil into ditches and cutting fresh scars through newly planted fields. But the Whitaker hillside looked almost unbelievable. Water still flowed, yet it moved quietly, patiently. Instead of racing downhill, much of it disappeared into the ground long before reaching the bottom of the pasture. Daniel slowly knelt beside one contour line and pressed both hands into the earth. The soil was soaked, but it wasn't collapsing. It held together as though the hillside itself had learned how to breathe again. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at a pasture that needed rescuing. He was looking at one that had begun rescuing itself. As the rain finally eased, another pickup rolled into the Whitaker driveway. Then another. Then another. Word travels faster than floodwater in ranch country. The same neighbors who had laughed at Hannah's collection of broken fence posts now stood quietly along the fence line, staring across the hillside in complete silence. No one made jokes. No one offered explanations. They simply watched. Because every one of them was asking the same impossible question. How had a 22-year-old woman transformed a pile of discarded cedar into something decades of expensive erosion projects had failed to achieve? None of them realized the story was about to travel far beyond their valley, because early the very next morning, a phone call from the state university would bring a team of researchers to the Whitaker Ranch, and what they discovered beneath Hannah's hillside would challenge something modern land management had quietly forgotten. By sunrise, every conversation at the local feed store began the same way. "Have you seen the Whitaker place?" The stories grew with every telling. Some claimed Hannah had invented a new kind of flood barrier. Others insisted she'd stumbled onto an expensive conservation technique nobody else could afford. A few simply refused to believe what their neighbors claimed to have witnessed. Walter Briggs smiled whenever he heard the rumors. "The truth's a lot simpler than that," he would say. "It just took someone willing to notice." 2 days later, 3 state conservation vehicles rolled onto the Whitaker Ranch. Along with them came a hydrologist from the state university, a rangeland ecologist, and a veteran soil scientist who had spent more than 30 years studying erosion across the northern plains. None of them arrived expecting a miracle. They came expecting to find the flaw. Hannah didn't greet them with a presentation. She simply handed over her weathered green notebook. Its pages had swollen from months of rain, dirt, and constant use. Every failed experiment was recorded inside, every adjustment after each storm, every sketch showing how the contour lines had slowly evolved. Then she quietly stepped aside. For nearly 3 hours, no one offered an opinion. They moved slowly across the hillside, stopping every few yards to take measurements. Soil cores disappeared into carefully labeled sample bags. Water infiltration tests were repeated again and again. One researcher climbed onto the neighboring slope before returning to compare fresh erosion scars with Hannah's contour lines. Another carefully brushed away the grass beneath the cedar posts, photographing the dense root systems before comparing them with decades-old survey maps. At one point, 2 members of the team began debating something in low voices while pointing toward the hillside. Hannah couldn't hear what they were saying. She only noticed one thing. No one looked skeptical anymore. They looked surprised. The afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds when the oldest member of the team finally stood. He brushed the damp soil from his hands and looked across the hillside one last time. "You know what's remarkable?" he asked quietly. Everyone waited. "There's almost nothing new here." A faint smile crossed his face. "This is old science." His eyes followed the gentle contour lines stretching across the pasture. "Remembered." The words settled over the hillside like the silence after rain. Generations before satellite imagery, laser surveying, and computer models, ranchers had learned to read the land simply by living on it. Somewhere along the way, much of that quiet knowledge had been forgotten. Hannah hadn't invented a revolutionary farming system. She had rediscovered one. Within weeks, neighboring ranchers were asking if they could walk the Whitaker pasture themselves. The same men who had once delivered broken fence posts as a joke now arrived carrying notebooks instead. Even Carl Benson came back. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. Hannah smiled gently. "You don't." Carl looked across the hillside. "I thought you were trying to prove everyone else wrong." He paused. "You were just listening to the land better than the rest of us." For the first time since returning home, Hannah allowed herself to believe the ranch might truly have a future. But the greatest surprise wasn't the field report, or the researchers, or even the neighbors who suddenly wanted to learn. It was waiting inside Daniel Whitaker's workshop. Hidden beneath decades of dust was a weathered notebook Hannah had never seen before, written by her own grandfather. And inside it, she would discover that someone in her own family had uncovered the very same secret nearly 60 years earlier. That evening, after the last truck had disappeared down the gravel road, Daniel quietly carried an old notebook into the kitchen. Its faded leather cover was cracked with age. The corners had softened from decades of use. There was no title, only a name carefully written across the inside cover. Asterisk, asterisk, Samuel Whitaker, asterisk, asterisk, Hannah's grandfather. She had heard stories about him all her life, but he had passed away before she was old enough to understand the quiet way he studied the land. Carefully, she opened the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a field journal. Its pages were filled with weather notes, grazing records, small sketches of the hills, and observations collected over years of walking the ranch. One sentence stopped her completely. Asterisk, never fight the water. Give it time to think. She read it once, then again. A slow smile crossed her face. Samuel hadn't been writing instructions. He'd been recording lessons the land had taught him. As the pages continued, Hannah found ideas that felt astonishingly familiar. Not detailed instructions, not measurements, not finished designs, just quiet observations, curved sketches of hillsides, notes about where rain lingered after storms, simple reminders to follow the shape of the land instead of forcing it. They weren't answers. They were the same questions Hannah had spent the past year asking herself. Daniel watched her turn another page. "I remember seeing him write in that notebook almost every night," he said softly. "I just never realized he was trying to save something. Neither had anyone else. Until now." Over the following months, the Whitaker Ranch became something unexpected. Not a tourist attraction, not a showcase farm, a place where people came to learn. Conservation groups organized field walks across the hillside. Young ranchers arrived carrying notebooks instead of assumptions. Older ranchers arrived carrying memories they hadn't spoken about in years. Many quietly remembered techniques their parents and grandparents had once practiced before time, machinery, and changing habits slowly pushed those lessons aside. The conversations became just as valuable as the demonstrations. Knowledge that had nearly disappeared found its way back into the fields where it belonged. One crisp autumn morning, Hannah stood on the same hillside where her first experiment had nearly failed. Visitors no longer noticed the broken cedar posts first. They noticed the healthy grass, the firm soil beneath their boots, wildflowers returning between the contour lines, songbirds nesting where they hadn't been seen in years. After every rainfall, water no longer rushed through the pasture in muddy torrents. Asterisk, asterisk, the hillside was no longer fighting every storm. It had remembered how to welcome the rain. Asterisk, asterisk, Hannah rested her hand on one of the weathered cedar posts. A year earlier, people had seen nothing more than broken wood. Now they saw something entirely different. Proof that the greatest solutions aren't always inventions. Sometimes they're quiet truths waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps that was the real asterisk, asterisk, fence secret asterisk, asterisk. It was never about broken cedar posts. It was about paying attention long enough to notice what the land had been teaching all along. If Samuel Whitaker hadn't taken the time to write down his observations, some of those lessons might have disappeared forever. And if Hannah had listened to the laughter instead of her curiosity, they might never have been rediscovered. We'd love to know. Asterisk, asterisk, have you ever seen an old tradition or forgotten skill solve a modern problem? Asterisk, asterisk, tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories where patience, practical wisdom, and quiet determination reveal extraordinary outcomes, consider subscribing. Because somewhere, On another forgotten farm, someone may already be noticing a lesson the rest of the world has yet to see.